Well, good afternoon. Good of you few left here to listen to the last session. Well, as you can gather, I have a Scottish accent, and I can't help that, but I met a Southern belle back in South Carolina way back in the 70s and took her to Scotland, and she forced me to come back because Scotland doesn't have the blue skies and the sunshine every day. In fact, Scotland's well known to have 4 seasons in one day. Anyway, I came to Clemson back in the 70s. I was in a different career altogether. We went back to Scotland 14 years. I was in an engineering business, and but we came back in '93, did a joint venture with an engineering company called C.A. Brown Boveri. They were based in Chattanooga, or one of their divisions. But anyway, I was getting a bit discouraged about where I was going, and I joke about the inventor of the internet, but he did a good job. So no names mentioned. So my wife said, "Why don't you do something on the internet?" And that's exactly what I did. And I have a passion. I'm a cook. I love to taste good things, so I thought, well, you know, food is the thing that I really should focus on. Food and beverages and candies and so on. So I started out in a very small way and got in touch with somebody that was already importing some Scottish food products. And so they supplied me, and eventually they did some drop shipping for me. But as time grew on, how many of you are familiar with Scotland's other national drink called Iron Brew? Okay, right, okay. Well, a friend of mine used to golf with Robin Barr, who was the chairman of AG Barr at that time back in the 20s, the noughties, I mean, early 2000s. And so he gave me an introduction to Robin Barr, who was a bit of a coothy fellow, really, because he said to me, well, you can import Iron Brew if you want, but don't expect us to help you with any of the marketing. Oh, okay, thanks very much. So we actually, what happened, there was time passed, and then all of a sudden an email came, not just to me, but to other British importers, that the story about Iron Brew was it was made with a dye that's acceptable to the European market, but the FDA had condemned it for years. But Iron Brew was coming across the Atlantic, called grey Iron Brew, even though there's orange. But one by one, these importers were caught, and you know, they weren't sent to jail or anything like that. The product was just destroyed somewhere out in the Arizona desert or something. Target practice. So anyway, I got this email from AG Barr, and they said they had they reformulated the product so that they could use a dye that was acceptable to the FDA. And I said, wow, that's great. Now, the only problem was I had to commit to a whole container load. That's 21 pallets of Iron Brew. But then the FDA, just because it said on the label that we were using a different dye, the FDA, you know, they didn't believe us, you see. So one of my distributors said, you know, there is a way you can convince the FDA. If you take 5 consecutive shipments and send samples off to be analyzed, and that dye is not there, then submit those reports. So to cut a long story short, that's exactly what I did. Again, you know, I had to pay for all the costs of the laboratory examinations, etc. But we finally got this document from the FDA that we were now the kosher importers of Iron Brew. And so it developed from there. And to cut a very long story short, I've had a long association with AG Barr. They are now actively pursuing the US market, and in particular the big supermarket chains. So we are actually still importing for them, but we don't have to pay for the product. So we're importing it, we're storing it in a warehouse, and then we're sending it out to their various distributors throughout the country. It's a very nice arrangement. We charge a service fee for that, but we have a good relationship. You know, the thing is about business, I'm sure I'm not telling you, people do business with people at the end of the day. And if you don't build a relationship, even if it's very hard to begin with, you've got to work away at it. So we have, at the moment, this good relationship. But things can change. I mean, you know, our biggest struggles right now, we're not really affected by Brexit, and yet we are indirectly because, for instance, the cost of sugar has gone up. So a lot of our products, like our candies, our marmalades and all that are made over there, have sugar. So we've seen you know, a 15% increase in the cost of their products. You know, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon. But I guess the COVID effect, the biggest effect we had was the cost of containers trebled during that time. We were normally paying about $3,200 for a 40-foot container. That's now went up to $9,500. It's still $9,000. So we got to, you know, we're constantly having to change our pricing, but it's not that easy to change the price and tell people, well, you know, here's why. So it's a bit of a challenge sort of thing, especially if you're doing business with Amazon, which we do. That's a big outlet for us, as well as direct to the consumer. And we do a lot with wholesalers. We tend not to deal with distributors like companies called KeHE's, a big distributor, because they'll hit you every which way but loose, and your margin ends up being in single digits. It's just not worth the effort. But Amazon, they take some pretty big hits too, but you have to navigate. And it's thanks to my son, who came in the business 12 years ago, that he took over the Amazon account, because I just didn't have the patience for it. But I'll give him all due credit. He persevered. To me, he's Mr. Amazon. Some companies call him for his advice. How do we do this? You know, so you know, he's got a future career if he wants to be in that business. You know, pricing is the biggest issue, especially when you're importing something, because the exchange rate. You know, you can't keep changing your price on customers. You've got to set a price. But now what we're doing is we're recalibrating probably about every 6 months. You know, we used to get away with just maybe once every 2 years, but right now the exchange rate with the British pound is starting to creep. It's about 1.25. That's still low compared with what, 5 years ago when it was 140. So we've had some gains, you know, there, but it is a tricky aspect. Now, all of you know, and I'm sure you all love haggis, and you know the story of haggis. We can't import haggis. The meat variety, you can import the vegetarian variety, but who wants to eat a vegetarian haggis? Come on. I was out at a games in Texas many years ago, the Arlington Games there, and I met this very larger-than-life guy called Jim Walters. He just retired from the Boy Scouts Association and decided he'd been over to a trip in Scotland, tasted haggis for the first time, thought he could import it, couldn't. He had experience with being a cook in the Navy. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but anyway, he and his wife decided to come up with a haggis recipe using sirloin beef, and but not so much of the offal that you will find in haggis in Scotland. Anyway, very successful. It's a kind of American version of haggis, and that's been one of our biggest, you know, domestic suppliers. We've actually, he died a few years ago, and his wife's still alive, and we have an agreement with her about taking on the brand. So there's that, and then there's things like we deal with a guy up in Maine, if you all know what a Finnan haddock is. We had, you know, Cullen skink. Are you familiar with a soup called Cullen skink? That's made with Finnan haddock. Well, this guy went to Scotland to learn how to cold smoke haddock. So we deal with some domestic suppliers, is what I'm trying to say. It's a blend. And then we've got a company down in Florida that does a whole range of meat pies and bangers and so on. So we deal with that. So you have to keep thinking outside the box. What else can we do? It's been, you know, for me, you know, he calls me an entrepreneur. I don't really think of myself an entrepreneur. I'm really just a bit of an idiot that takes too many chances. And some of them work, some of them don't, you know. But anyway, the things are also changing. You know, obviously, our main customers in the early days were the older generation. we've got to reach out to the younger generation, but you can't use the tools that you were using 15 years ago to do that. You've got to start embracing social media and influencers. Now, our company, we can't afford to have somebody on board on our payroll, so there's a lot of contracting out nowadays. So we've got a group of ladies, they're all in their 40s, very good looking, I must admit, if their photos are true, actually. But anyway, they do a great job of social media influencing and guiding us with our website, which is undergoing a complete reconstruction. That's the other thing. You design a website, 3 years, give it 3 years, you have to change your website, because otherwise it just gets, it's old. It's old. People like new things. So anyway, it's a privilege to have been able to speak here. John didn't really tell me, so I was caught off guard, but I'll leave you with this thought. If it's not Scottish, it's crap.